In what is quickly becoming a tradition, I guess, whenever we visit South Africa, I like to review, purely for the sake of it really, the car that I hire at any given trip. Last time, of course, I did the Toyota Corolla Quest. I was grateful for the comments that were left on that one, some corrections, because of course, not having them here in the UK, it's not a car that I'm as familiar with. Likewise with this one, this is not a UK vehicle. Of course, we do have Nissans, but not this one, which is called the Magnite. These were produced from 2020 onward. And for this review, not only does my girlfriend Keeasha also, of course, make a visual drop-in, if you will, like last time, but also we thought, why not get her in the video as well for her thoughts on the car? So stick around for that because she is making a guest appearance. This vehicle is categorised by Nissan themselves as a subcompact crossover SUV. Quite the mouthful. It's technically the smallest SUV, if you want to call it that, worldwide that Nissan makes. To call it one is a big stretch, given how small this car is. It barely weighs a metric ton, and it's only front-wheel drive. So to call it an SUV, as I said, is very much a stretch. It's more like a soft roader, like a rough and tumble hatchback to some degree, and it does share its platform, unsurprisingly for Nissan, with a couple of different Renaults, like the Triber, I believe it is, the Kygo, the Kwid. So again, that same kind of smaller crossover vibe. Now, we did see a couple of other ones of these while driving around, but definitely no way near as many as we saw Corollas last time, and even this time as well. Now, these were sold in a bunch of different markets, including Indonesia, of course South Africa, Nepal, Bhutan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Brunei, Uganda, Kenya, Seychelles, Mozambique, Zambia, Mauritius, Tanzania, and Macau. Quite the swath of different places that these are sold. Like I said, not here in the UK, so it's not a car that we see over here. This was interestingly initially planned to be a Datsun model, not a Nissan model. That didn't pan out, so of course they ended up calling it just a Nissan, as it is here. It's, as mentioned, front engine, front wheel drive. They are all petrol, as far as I can tell, and there are a couple of different engines. The one here that I'm driving in particular had the CVT transmission, like the Corolla last time, and we'll talk more about that transmission in a second, because it was definitely an improvement over the Toyota, probably one of the key advantages that this car has, in fact. And also this was the turbo version. Now, both the turbo and non-turbo versions of this car are both 1 litre 3-cylinder motors. The non-turbo version is a BR10, and then the turbo is a HRA0DET motor. Performance is fine for a car like this. You don't buy it for performance, of course. You've got around 100 horsepower, 74 kilowatts. 0 to 60, or in other words, 0 to 100 kilometers per hour is about 13-second region. Flat out, you can do just over 170 kilometers an hour. So what's that, like 110-ish miles an hour, close enough. And it has about 150 newton meters of torque. So 100 horses, 150 newtons. Not exactly numbers to write home about, but again, being so small and so light with that front-wheel drive chassis, it's a recipe to, at the very least, be quite fun to drive, if not quick. Quick, it definitely isn't, although with the turbo, it's, I would imagine, an improvement over the non-turbo. It certainly didn't feel too slow in traffic. It was adequate enough. And of course, more importantly than performance, you have stuff like practicality. Now, speaking first of all to its economy, which is probably one of the things you're most interested in, it's rated at 6 litres of petrol per 100 kilometres by Nissan themselves. It has a 40-litre tank. In the UK, their quote equates to about 47 miles per gallon, and in our experience of driving it, we covered just over 400 kilometres in a week, about 406 I think it was, and that cost us about 800 rand to fill the car up. So not too bad. Not necessarily the cheapest thing around, but certainly not overly expensive. About 250 miles, in other words, for about the equivalent of £40 here in the UK. So a lot more efficient than the kind of cars that I typically drive. Interestingly, to me at least though, much like the Corolla, I do find it a bit weird that the economy isn't better than that on these cars. For something with such a small engine that's so lightweight, I do find it curious that it doesn't do even more. But like I said with the Corolla, it definitely feels like you're working with like a generation or two older technology here, which for the most part is correct with many of these market vehicles. The Corolla directly so, it was carried over. This one wouldn't surprise me if there's some of that there as well, because when you consider, for example, like a larger sedan, diesel for example, you can get surprisingly good fuel economy out of many, and even though this isn't a diesel, I would have still expected better than the equivalent of 47 to the gallon, maybe even more like 55 or even 60. Of course, the transmission can make a difference, and speaking of that transmission, this is definitely an improvement over the Toyota. Both of them, of course, have CVTs. This one, though, did not have anywhere near as much weird hesitation going down hills as the Toyota did. I won't, of course, repeat everything I said in that video because you can check out that review if you want to, but for now, this one was simply way smoother. The transmission did exactly what you want it to do and just got on with it like an automatic should. Now, you can incidentally get it, just like the Toyota, with a couple of different variations of gearbox. You can get the X-Tronic, which is this one, the CVT, or you can get a 5-speed manual. A lot of people probably prefer the manual anyway. For me, especially on hilly roads, I just don't see the point of messing around with the clutch. Just have an automatic and your life's a lot easier. And as I said, the weight is very, very low. For our American friends, it's around 2,300 pounds or so. It's about 1,100 kilos, less than 1.1 metric tons technically, so it's not heavy. It's not heavy at all. In terms of space, for me, I thought that the space was decent. For a car that is this small, even a taller driver like myself, I didn't have any issues with headroom. The rear seats, not so much. Front ones were good enough. Boot space, I would actually say, was surprisingly good for a car of its size. With a couple of fairly decent sized travel bags, there was no issue at all getting those in the boot. So for shopping, for example, even if you wanted to go and play golf, you can get these kind of things into the car without, for example, putting the rear seats down. So for me at least, I think that's quite respectable for a car that is this small. In terms of pricing, of course this could vary, so I'm just basing this on Nissan's own website numbers. The base model, like the absolute most affordable manual version, starts at 228,000 Rand. Then the Turbo is around 330 to 350,000 Rand, and if you want the Turbo with the manual, it's 307,000. Now, like I said, I'm sure that varies depending on where you are, and depending on what dealership and what kind of markups you're working with, but at least those are Nissan's own quoted numbers. They could have changed, of course, being on sale since 2020. Now, just before I get to my personal final thoughts on the car, I want to do kind of a call-in style recording, jumping over to Keeasha for her thoughts.
There are only two things I liked about the car, which is I like the radio, and I like that the gearbox did not make a weird noise like the last one. And then I've got a lot of things that I hated about the car. Which one do I start with? I hated the back seats because they were really tiny. The aircon, it made really loud noise and it was very distracting. I couldn't even hear my radio, which is one of the things I liked. The worst thing about this car, I hated how close the windshield was to my face. It was very uncomfortable. I felt very weird. I hated the locking system because I felt like the doors weren't locked the whole time and Michael would be driving on the freeway and I'd just grab the door and try tugging on it just to make sure it was locked, and that seems very dangerous, but I didn't trust the locking system. Oh yeah, it looked disgusting. I hated the way it looked. It to me, it looks like a frog. Like a little, what's the word called? Like a bullfrog, you know, the one with the big back. Like, I wouldn't tell people, oh, go buy this car. I mean, like, save your money. Like, the Corolla, I'd have been like, yeah, I'd buy that car. Like, I'd drive that. Like, it makes sense. This car, not so much.
So your overall verdict is that you wouldn't recommend it, and that you would
My overall verdict is save your money. Get something else. Get a Polo.
Okay.
So with Keeasha's much more scathing review overall than mine, with a couple of positives, but mostly not so much, it's great to have both perspectives, because I tend to focus in more on like the tech side, the engineering side, the kind of mechanical aspects of the car in terms of driving it, efficiency, all that kind of stuff. And then she, of course, is referring mostly to the actual living with the car, which in the case of a car like this is very good to know. So I'm glad that we had her in for this one. Doubtless we'll feature her in more reviews in future as well, because she does take a more real-world approach, which for many consumers is probably at least as valuable, if not more so, than the stuff that I have to say anyway. So my overall thoughts on the car were, I definitely preferred the Corolla, which of course is technically a different class of vehicle. It is bigger, it's a saloon, whereas this is the subcompact crossover SUV, whatever they want to call it, so it is different. But I feel it is fair to compare them because the pricing isn't too much different. They both come with the CVTs. Fuel economy isn't crazy in terms of difference. This one is definitely better, but it's not a ridiculous difference. Even in terms of space, the Corolla is better, but this one has better access because of the hatchback, so I think it's fairly justified to have them rivaling each other. You certainly see plenty of both of them around. So my verdict on this one is, I actually am not as scathing on the looks as Keeasha is. She's not a fan. I wouldn't say it's a pretty car, but I do think it's got a funky design. It kind of reminds me of what I'd expect from something like a Suzuki or a Seat. I think it looks perfectly fine. Nothing special, but it's interesting at least to look at. It's not drab, it's not overly boring. In terms of the driving experience, well, of course you don't buy a car like this for performance. Fast it definitely isn't, but it's quick enough. Certainly for city driving, the fact that it is small and light and nimble, especially with the CVT transmission, it means that you can zip in and out of traffic and park it easily and get around tight corners, all that kind of stuff it's great for. In fact, again, like with the transmission, that is one of the key places where this will have an advantage over something that is bigger, like the aforementioned Corolla, and certainly vehicles that are even bigger than that. Ultimately, of course, in terms of pricing, that'll be a personal thing as to whether or not you find it to be within your price range, or if you think it's worth it to you to buy a car like this over one of its rivals. I think for me personally, to agree with what Keeasha said, she prefers the Polo. My initial rental was for something like a Polo. It got changed to this one, so even for me, I was intending to have the Volkswagen. I do prefer Volkswagen as a brand. I've owned a number of them, so even for me, I would definitely say I would go for the Volkswagen. But for me, this was an interesting change of pace. I found the interior design to be quite good. I quite like the interior. Of course, she wasn't a fan of it. The dash really didn't bother me at all, and you'd think of the two of us it would bother me more. But yeah, I thought it was a perfectly fine car. Nothing particularly special, and for me, nothing that was really a deal breaker. Definitely the biggest improvement over the Toyota from last time was that transmission, but ultimately that's it for our combined thoughts. And of course, if you want to check out that Corolla review as well, that is also here on the channel, and of course stick around for more in future. But for now, from the both of us, thanks for watching.